Neo-Impressionism was a style of painting that developed in France in the 1880s, which, as you may well have guessed from the somewhat unimaginative name, functions as a kind of sequel to Impressionism. We've already discussed the Impressionists in another video, which you can check out here, but today I want to take a look at how the Neo-Impressionists were in many ways much more modern than their classic Impressionist counterparts. The most well-known difference between classic and Neo-Impressionism is the latter's colourful dotted surfaces, which were the result of efforts by artists like Serra and Signac to incorporate new scientific discoveries regarding the properties of light and colour into their work. In addition to this, Neo-Impressionism also differed from its predecessor by being a much more socially and politically active movement. Rather than being content to simply paint the modern world, the Neo-Impressionists went one step further and offered a critique of it, one which was rooted in the connections of many of the artists involved to anarchism, a popular and occasionally violent political ideology that grew out of the increasingly notable social disparities of the day. So, today, we're going to take a look at this movement, the painters involved, and the context of their times to understand how these factors shaped Neo-Impressionism and, in turn, the development of modern art. The story of Neo-Impressionism begins with the movement's luminary Serra, who was born in 1859 and is said to have displayed a precocious intellect from a young age. After taking some lessons with an uncle who dabbled in painting, he decided to enroll in the École des Beaux-Arts to study the traditional academic methods, which mainly involve producing endless drawings from plaster casts and models. From his early works, we can see that he took to the basics quite well, but like many other painters of the day, he felt quite constrained by the academy's methods and only spent about a year in the institution before leaving for military service, the prospect of being shot at apparently being preferable to drawing any more plaster casts. During his brief military career, he came into contact with the works of the Impressionists. The fluid colour sensibilities and modern subject matter of painters like Monet and Pissarro were unlike anything he had seen in the academy, and they would feed his growing interest in Impressionist art and the properties of colour itself. This interest in colour was rather timely, as during this period the understanding of how light and colour work was being expanded through new scientific discoveries by notable figures such as Michel-Eugène Chevreul, Charles Blanc and Ogden Rood. Their formulations of the properties of colour were of great interest to Serra, who saw these discoveries as emblematic of the new modern era. His studies of their theories would lead him to begin devising a manner of painting that would reflect the new modern age through not only its subject matter, but its methods as well. In addition to his interest in science, Serra was also quite aware of the social and political upheavals of his era, changes to the fabric of society which had been brought about as a result of modernisation. As such, a distinct trait of Serra's work, and Neo-Impressionism in general, is not only its scientific approach to colour, but also a focus on subjects that expose the changing society of the day. This aspect appears from quite an early stage in Serra's career, with his first major work, Bathers at Asnières, which he exhibited at the Independent Salon of 1884, a show which Serra himself was involved in organising that offered artists a chance to show work that was too far out there for the ever-conservative Salon, which, as we will see, Bathers most definitely was. In Bathers, Serra depicts a group of men lounging on a hot summer's day by the banks of the River Seine. The first thing we may notice about it is the somewhat unusual painting style, which, while reminiscent of the bright colours of Impressionism, has a somewhat stiff, almost neoclassical kind of feel to it. This is a result of the many distinctly non-Impressionist working methods that Serra is using, which set this work apart from regular Impressionism in some pretty interesting ways. Firstly, Serra didn't paint outdoors as the Impressionists had. He instead built this work by creating studies in his studio and planning every aspect in advance. We can see this reflected in his composition, which is closer to the manner of a classical academic painting than the loose snapshot style of Impressionism. Serra has placed each of the picture's elements carefully to create a scene with a sense of stillness and calm that evokes the serenity of a hot summer's afternoon. He also uses this refined composition to allude to art history, which the more modern-minded Impressionism pretty much never did. The side-on view we see of these figures recalls the style of ancient Greek paintings, though their podgy physiques and the lack of a single strong jawline among them tells us that these are no heroes or gods, but real people instead. Another difference is the large scale of the piece, which is about 2 by 3 meters across, more akin to the size of a prestigious history painting than typically smaller Impressionist scenes. Large sizes were traditionally reserved for really important subjects, like justifications of war and portraits of inbred Habsburg princes, but Serra uses this imposing scale to give a sense of importance and even dignity to his subjects, which is the key to understanding this work. This subject matter, which as a scene of modern leisure may at first seem similar to earlier works by the likes of Renoir, is perhaps the biggest difference between this work and previous Impressionist efforts, as Serra's subject, unlike Renoir's endless sea of bourgeois women, is a group of working class people. The title alone implies this, as Asnières was a working class area and the site of a lot of heavy industry, which the factories in the background indicate, as do the figures' simple unfashionable clothing, dodgy haircuts and their bright white skin, unaccustomed to the sun from working indoors all day. We may also note that these figures are all men. Renoir-style scenes of leisure usually featured a good mix of the sexes, but not here. Serra has done this to imply the kind of lives these workers lead. There are no women, or children present for that matter, because given the era, they themselves are probably working. Unlike Renoir's wealthy subjects, stay-at-home wives or family days out are not on the cards for these people, as every member of their immediate family was likely employed in factories like the one we see in the background, the very inclusion of which also tells us of the centrality of such work to these people's lives. Even in their free time, its presence dominates. Working class people such as this would have been a common sight around town, but they were not a common subject for paintings. At least not in the way Serra was doing it. Depictions of the working class usually showed them, conveniently, as jolly, happy folks, or at the very least, working. Even the Impressionists, who were supposedly engaged in the painting of modern life, often limited that goal to people of the proper social standing. Never mind the academics who were too busy painting nymphs and satyrs to even register the basic reality around them. Serra, by contrast, draws our attention to these people and even lends them the kind of dignity fine art usually reserved for aristocracy by showing them not as joyous serfs or productive workers, but as human beings at rest, no different to any other. This choice of subject and how Serra has framed it through his composition and art historical allusions is key to understanding the advances of Neo Impressionism. Serra is not just showing us a fleeting moment of modern life a la Impressionism, he is showing us a scene that reflects the issues of his day and lends a sense of importance and dignity to a subject many would have considered unworthy of such treatment. The painting elicited a wide variety of reactions when it was shown, most of them being less than positive. There were some, however, who saw value in Serra's efforts, including Paul Signac, who had also been involved in the independent salon and found himself drawn to Serra's nascent Neo-Impressionist style. Serra was still working out all the details, of course, and so over the course of the next 2 years, he would undertake a period of study and experimentation in preparation for a follow-up to the Bathers, which would see him arrive at his mature Neo-Impressionist style. Before we go on, let's take a moment to discuss some of the mechanics behind the methods Serra was developing. As mentioned earlier, Serra was quite interested in science and derived his techniques directly from his readings of newly published research into the properties of colour and light. Key amongst these new ideas was Michel Eugene Chevreul's discovery of what he termed the law of simultaneous contrast. Chevreul discovered that when two colours are placed in close proximity to each other, each one will appear as if it contains a hint of the neighbouring colour's complementary or opposing colour. He found that, for example, if we are to place a dark red and a light yellow next to one another, each one will take on a hint of the other's complementary. The red will appear to have a hint of violet, the complementary of yellow, while the yellow will be perceived as being slightly more green, the respective complement of red. In addition to this, the law of contrast also goes for tones of light and dark. A dark colour placed next to a light will make the light seem lighter and the dark seem darker. A saturated colour next to a desaturated one will also seem more vibrant. Cool colours placed in opposition to warm ones will seem cooler, as will warms when placed against cools. These optical effects can result in any one colour being perceived quite differently based on where it is placed in relation to any other. This effect was somewhat intuitively understood by painters for centuries, who saw it firsthand in the mixing of endless greys and browns for academic paintings, which took full advantage of this effect. Chevreul was, however, the first person to actually put it into more or less scientifically accurate terms. By following these methods, Serra intended to make paintings which would allow colours to mix and contrast in the eye, thus producing more vivid colours than were ever possible otherwise. In the 2 years following the exhibition of Bathers, Serra would synthesise all this information with the Impressionist style's painting of modern life and his own interest in the changing social order of his day, to at last arrive at his mature Neo-Impressionist style. He demonstrated this at the last Impressionist exhibition in 1886 with his masterpiece, A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, which, despite opposition from Degas, would cause quite a stir and become the visual manifesto for the style. This work, which probably needs no introduction owing to frequent appearances and parodies in popular media, is once again huge, and the subject is, as it was in Bathers, another scene of modern life, though this time it is a far more well-to-do crowd that we see at play. This scene takes place in an area on the other side of the river from Asnières, which was a favourite spot of wealthy Parisians to visit on sunny afternoons. In front of this leafy backdrop, Serra constructs a complex scene with close to 40 figures enjoying the shade of the trees, in a dappled composition of dark and light that shows off the now luminous qualities of the Neo-Impressionist style. The myriad dots prescribed by Chevreul's colour theories cover every square inch of this work and vibrate with intensity as Serra builds harmonies in colourful dots by the hundreds and thousands. If we look closely, we can even observe how the blues, greens, yellows and reds are all applied with an intensity that is tempered by a rational logic, each colour placed carefully in relation to another. We can also see how the paint is applied more or less unmixed. Instead of mixing, Serra builds layers of dots, which combine in the eye to produce the colour he desired. We can see this in the water, which has layers of lead white, viridian, emerald green and ultramarine blue placed over one another. Or in areas like this figure's dress, which have layers of white, yellow and green, with a final layer of ultramarine and red that ends up producing a sort of purplish tone. During the painting of this work, he also abandoned earth tones, a staple of any painter's palette altogether, choosing to rely instead solely on strong hues of pure colour. As was the case in Bathers, Serra composed this work in his studio, and his intention was once again to show us a glimpse of the complex social world of his day, this time the world of the wealthy. He does this by showing us many signs of the figure's wealth and social standing. These include gentlemen decked out in their finery, fashionable ladies sheltering from the summer heat under umbrellas, well-to-do couples with their children, a trumpeter playing music for two soldiers who stand rigidly to attention, a woman fishing and another taking her pet monkey for a walk, as you do. There is also a young girl in red who is conspicuously the only figure in motion, and another girl in white who is quizzically looking right at us, as if to ask what all of these people are doing in this strange frozen scene. This still quality is present once again as it was in the Bathers, but now Serra is leaning into it to evoke a sense of social rigidity and even isolation in his subjects. For though there are many figures in this busy scene, each one seems disconnected from the others, as if they are all lost in thought or somehow separated from one another. This reflects the view at the time of the upper classes as being out of touch or disconnected from the rest of society and even from one another. As we saw in Bathers, industrialization had changed the demographics of the city, and in contrast to the conditions many workers lived in, the conspicuous wealth and often ostentatious social lives of the upper classes were looking ever more disconnected and perhaps even immoral. Serra is alluding to this when he paints these folks as frozen and separate, trapped by their rigid social conventions. It's no coincidence that despite the Grand Chat being supposedly for all the people of Paris, most of the folks we see here seem to be wealthy, with the possible exception of the man with no sleeves in the foreground who relaxes with his pipe, clearly not too bothered with keeping up appearances. Serra also alludes to the perceived immorality of these folks with two of the female figures who both convey signs of prostitution, which, as we may recall from Renoir, was a favourite pastime for the wealthy of the day. One of the women is fishing, as in fishing for clients, while the other, with her pet monkey, is a bit of wordplay, the French word for a female monkey, Signac, also being a slang term for a prostitute. Besides throwing shade at sex workers, Serra also implies a kind of immorality in these people by literally placing them in the shade. In contrast to the lads over in Agnières who are in the full light of day, the folks at the Grand Chat are half hidden in shadows, perhaps implying the sun setting on their way of life and dawning on a new one on the other side of the river. Le Grand Chat, when read in tandem with the Bathers, gives us an interesting view of life on the other side of the tracks, or river in this case, and shows us how the rapidly modernising Paris of the day was exposing disparities between different parts of society. While the scientifically inspired painting methods do mark this as a very modern work, its carefully handled social critique is an equally modern aspect that caught the attention of many at the time. Le Grand Chat proved Serra's mastery and launched the movement properly into the public eye. The work attracted the attention of the critic Félix Fénien, who criminally popularised the term Neo Impressionism to describe the style, over the other, far better terms for it, such as pointillism, divisionism, or Serra's preferred designator and my personal favourite, chromoluminairism, which is just a great word. Fénien's championing did, however, attract more artists to paint in the style, including Camille Pissarro, the ever-present central square in the Impressionist bingo card, who, alongside his son Lucien, took to Neo-Impressionism like a duck to water. It also brought many other painters to the banner, such as Henri Edmond Cross and Maximilien Luce, who was, to put it mildly, even more focused on social issues than Serra had been. Just as things were looking up for the style, however, it was dealt a critical blow when Serra passed away unexpectedly from an unknown infection at the age of only 31. Serra's early death left us a relatively small catalogue of works. His final unfinished painting, entitled Circus, offers us one last compelling demonstration of his skill through its careful balancing of blue and yellow harmonies, as well as the dynamism of shape he achieved to evoke motion, joy and energy despite the static qualities of his demanding style. He also, once again, codes subtle observations of Parisian social life into this work, with well-dressed figures in the front row seats giving way to working class figures in the nosebleeds above. While Serra was somewhat reclusive, to the point where we don't know much of his opinions directly, the presence of these themes in many of his works indicates their importance to him. His friend, Paul Signac, who would take up the Neo-Impressionist cause in Serra's place, is by contrast a bit of a different story. He, alongside others like Finian and Luce, were a lot more vocal about their opinions, and the direction they would take the style in would bring Neo-Impressionism's critique of the modern world right to the forefront in the years following Serra's untimely death. Paul Signac was a trained architect and a self-taught artist who converted to the Neo-Impressionist approach after seeing Serra's work in the Independent Salon of 1884. The two became close friends, and the extroverted Signac would help the more introverted Serra to make connections in the art world and evangelise the Neo-Impressionist style. Signac was from a well-to-do middle-class family, and as a man of some means, he had plenty of time to work with Serra and help him to develop the new pointillist methods. While Serra had turned his interest to scenes of urban life, Signac's favourite subjects were more traditional pastoral landscapes and coastal scenes, which he painted in the Neo-Impressionist style. He also provided an important contribution to Neo-Impressionism in the form of a much belated written manifesto, titled From Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, in which he traced a connection from the great colourist Delacroix to the efforts of the Neo-Impressionists, and outlined the nuances of the style's colour theories. Signac's publicising and written evangelising of Neo-Impressionism was crucial to the style's survival following the death of Serra, but his most important contribution may well be the role he played in Neo-Impressionism's increasing connection to the anarchist movement. The connection between anarchism and Neo-Impressionism can seem a bit unlikely at first, as today we typically associate anarchy with violent revolution, punk aesthetics, and a general disdain for all things orderly, which might not be the first thing that comes to mind when we think of lovely paintings of the French countryside. The connection becomes clearer, however, when we consider the political context of the day, which, as we saw in Serra's work, was fraught with issues of industrialisation, exploitation of workers, and increasing class conflict, all of which anarchism proposed a response to. Anarchism is a huge topic in itself that, in a fittingly anarchic fashion, can somehow incorporate views ranging from anarcho-communism to anarcho-capitalism, but to put it generally for our purposes here, anarchism is anti-hierarchical, focused on the autonomy of the individual, and opposed to large centralised powers. Its popularity in France at the time had grown out of a myriad of factors, such as the French people's seemingly inherent love of revolution, and the opposition it offered to increasingly centralised powers of industry. Proponents of anarchism, such as Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Peter Prokoptin, and Jean Grave, who was a friend of Signac's, had also popularised the ideology among artistic and literary circles, and as a result, many among the Neo-Impressionists were sympathetic to its cause. The anarchist activism of the period took two distinct forms: the propaganda of the deed and the propaganda of the word, both of which sought to popularise anarchist ideals and attract more people to its cause. Unfortunately, the propaganda of the deed frequently involved violence, bombings, and general, anarchy, which dissuaded many from participating. The propaganda of the word was a bit less extreme and sought to popularise anarchism through the arts and culture, which is where Neo-Impressionism comes in. While most Neo-Impressionists were perhaps unlikely to throw a bomb, many of them saw the anarchist ideal of a harmonious society based around the individual as running parallel to their own interests in a harmonious organisation of individual colours. Thus, in the eyes of painters like Signac and critics like Finian, Neo-Impressionism became a visual analogy for the anarchists' political goals. On another level, there was a compelling similarity between the anarchists and the Neo-Impressionists in their shared interest in science. Many of the influential anarchist thinkers had scientific backgrounds and advocated using the new discoveries of the era as a basis for their proposed reorganisation of society, in a manner that's quite similar to how Serra had reorganised his palette and techniques according to Chevreul's theories. This parallel once again draws a connection between the anarchists and the Neo-Impressionists, which was becoming ever more apparent as time went on. Whereas Serra had implied many of these ideas in his works, later Neo-Impressionists would tackle them much more directly. Pissarro and Luce both painted works that depicted the conditions of the workers and contributed images to anarchist publications, while others, such as Signac himself, painted works which proposed to show the anarchist ideal of a world where people, much like the colours of a Neo-Impressionist painting, lived in harmony. Signac's most well-known work in this regard is In the Time of Harmony. The Golden Age is not in the past, it is in the future. The initial title for this was In the Time of Anarchy, which, due to controversy, had to be changed. The painting is a pastoral scene set in the south of France, in which Signac shows us his vision of a world of anarchy. Far from being some sort of post-apocalyptic nightmare akin to Mad Max or Fallout, as we might envision today, Signac's version looks fairly pleasant, Everyone here seems pretty chilled out as they enjoy the healthy balance of work and leisure that anarchists promised. His inspiration for this work came from his friend Henri Edmond Cross, who proposed Signac paint a scene that was focused not on revolution itself, but on the ideal world that they thought revolution would create. Signac liked the idea and used the landscapes of the south, which were relatively untouched by industry unlike those of the north, as the setting for his vision. The sunny weather and fig trees tip us off that this is a southern landscape, and the idealised pastoral nature fits well with Signac's general enthusiasm for such scenes. Like Serra before him, however, he turns this seemingly straightforward subject into a political message through the careful arrangement of figures and socially charged symbols, which in many ways echoes Serra's own Le Grand Jatte. The figures this time around show many signs of work in industry, such as the shovel in the foreground, the harbour in the background, and a man sowing seeds, which doubles as a symbol for sowing the seeds of revolution. These signs of work are tempered by others that convey leisure, art, and learning, which we can see in the man who sits reading, the painter in the distance, the two lads playing bowls, and what appears to be some kind of 19th century rave taking place under a distant tree. There is also the couple, which Signac said represented the concept of free love, which was another radical notion of the day, and perhaps most radical of all, the rooster in the foreground, which itself is a symbol of revolution and a new dawn for France. What is most interesting about this work is what it tells us about Signac's conception of anarchism and how it differs from our own. Anarchism today is often characterised as destructive, but Signac certainly doesn't seem to see it this way. Instead, his fairly utopian vision advocates a need for balance. Work and industry are still present, but in Signac's idealised world, workers seem to exist in balance with industry, rather than under its boot. Signac's harmonious version is of course pretty biased, but reading into it demonstrates how art can tell us all sorts of interesting things about how people of different eras thought about the world, and it also shows us how the perceptions of concepts like anarchism, industrialisation, and even work itself can vary immensely from one period to another. Painting pictures which propagandised their beliefs wasn't the only way the Neo Impressionists showed their opposition to the powers of industry. In a rather amusing turn of events, Signac and some of the others would set up their own gallery in Paris, where they displayed and sold their works in direct opposition to the stranglehold of Paul Durand-Ruel on the art market. Durand-Ruel, who we covered in our look at Impressionism, was indeed a canny businessman, responsible in many ways for the success and also the commodification of the Impressionist style, an act which would have far-reaching cultural consequences in the 20th century. It's quite interesting to see such a direct act of opposition from the Neo Impressionists against the man who had made their forerunners successful, and it further illustrates that the differences between regular and Neo Impressionism run much deeper than just dotted surfaces. The gallery, however, alongside their anarchist beliefs and the Neo-Impressionist style itself, was doomed to failure. Suffering blows from the loss of Serra, the inherent difficulty of painting in the style, and the association with a political movement that was increasingly controversial, all conspired to put an end to the movement almost as quickly as it had begun. By the turn of the century, Neo-Impressionism would be supplanted by newer styles such as Fauvism, which were less overtly political and a good deal less strenuous to paint in. Signac would continue to paint and advocate his beliefs for the rest of his life. He would also play an important role in the next generation of painters, even working alongside Henri Matisse and André Derain, while they painted their own pointillist works and learned the importance of colour, though as a card-carrying member of the bourgeois class, the political aspects seem a little bit lost on Matisse. Neo-Impressionism is of course much more than just a historical footnote or sociological curiosity. Its methods and goals would inspire many future movements, from the Cubists who applied its separation and organisation of colour to their own organisation of spatial dimensions, to the Fauves, who took from it the evocative power of colour, but freed it from the need for strict adherence to scientific methodology. The style also helped to spread avant-garde painting to other parts of Europe, thanks to artists like Theo van Rysselberghe in Belgium and a veritable platoon of Italian divisionist painters who were inspired by the style. It also prefigures the intertwining of art and new political movements which is present in the 20th century, as competing ideologies saw art which reflected their values. From Picasso's association with communism to the Italian futurists' connection to fascism to the entire genre of Stalin-centric art we generally call Soviet realism, not to mention the enthusiastic role the CIA played in the weaponization of American art during the Cold War. Neo-Impressionism's association with anarchism is one of the first examples we see of this in modern art. Compared to some of those later examples, it will seem positively altruistic in contrast. Thanks for watching. Before I go, I have one small announcement to make. If you like the channel and you want to support what we do here, you can now donate to help us out at our new Buy Me a Coffee page. Buy Me a Coffee is one of those crowdfunding website type yokes that lets you donate to support creators and projects like ours. If you found these videos useful, if I've helped you out with that last minute essay, or if you just want to support what we do here, I'd really appreciate any help you can give. I research, write, edit and produce all of these videos by myself, which is fairly time consuming, and the equipment I use to do so is now almost as old as some of the paintings we discuss. There's beautiful high resolution images of many Neo Impressionist works that I just couldn't use as they resulted in my poor PC screaming for mercy and emitting clouds of black smoke while editing. This is what's encouraged me to take the plunge and ask for some help. With support, I can purchase new hardware to enable me to make better videos at a quicker pace, as well as purchasing books and access to online journals to further my research. I hope that the work I've done so far has been useful, and I want to continue to make more, with the goal of eventually having a full library of interconnected videos that will help us understand modern art without having to get a 4-year degree. So, if you want to help us out, you can find us at buymeacoffee/theartshole. I'll pop the link down below. If you don't fancy it, don't worry. I know these are precarious times for many, and just watching, subscribing or sharing the videos is more than enough to help out too. While I'm here, I just want to say thanks to everyone for watching. COVID has been a bit rough, but the upside for me has been getting to put more time into this channel and seeing it grow as a result, so a big thank you to everyone for that. If you want to reach out to me, you can do so in the comments below or by email at theartshole@gmail.com. I'll be back next month with a look at Thomas Cole's Course of Empire series, which is quite interesting, something I've wanted to do for a while, and then we're going to launch into a series of videos on Romanticism and Expressionism, two movements that I really want to cover before we get back into the big lads of the 20th century. It'll give me some time to figure out how to write the Duchamp video so it won't be 6 hours long. So that's it for today, thanks a million for watching and I'll see you all next time.